Why do geniuses like Tesla, Dickinson, or Newton prefer closed doors over crowded rooms? What drives brilliant minds away from social buzz? Arthur Schopenhauer, a tough and visionary thinker from the 19th century, saw this withdrawal as an almost inevitable instinct. For him, everyday interactions revolved around shallow talk, petty desires, and endless distractions, a show any exceptional spirit would wisely avoid. In the philosopher's words, solitude is the destiny of all superior minds. But to what extent is this distancing clear insight or simply an inability to blend in? Tesla would spend entire nights shaping his electrical ideas. Dickinson turned her own bedroom into a poetic laboratory. Newton found in silent hours the foundation for laws that would change the world. Had they uncovered a hidden privilege in quietness, or were they merely burdened by the weight of not fitting in? Some people seem destined to wander the planet alone. Today, we'll dive into Arthur Schopenhauer's ideas to figure out why highly intelligent minds usually don't pay much attention to social hustle, and whether that's a privilege or just an elegant form of distancing themselves. Let's get started. Imagine a genius, deep in thoughts racing ahead of everyday life. They let conversations about small talk drift by like the breeze. While the group chats about the weather forecast, they're pondering the fate of humanity. This difference in focus creates a gap that can't be bridged just by good intentions. For Schopenhauer, isolation wasn't a quirk of these individuals. It was a side effect of seeing further. The greater the intellectual reach, the rarer it becomes to find company able to exchange ideas on the same emotional level. The result is automatic distancing. Everyday worries seem too narrow for those who see existence on a broader scale. Without equal conversation partners, genius ends up walking alone, not out of arrogance, but simply because there's no echo. And for anyone who feels like an outsider in every room, this reasoning might offer some explanation, but not necessarily comfort. When outside voices quiet down, everyone hears their own name clearly. Avoiding solitude is ultimately running away from freedom, since genuine choices demand the absence of an audience. For Schopenhauer, withdrawing meant building a shelter from social expectations, not carrying a burden. He warned that daily interactions reduced intellect to shallow matters, stifling questions that needed room to grow. It's no coincidence that minds going beyond the obvious feel their surroundings shrinking. Nikola Tesla would stay awake all night, sparked by inspiration, worried that casual conversations would disrupt the flow of his experiments. Friedrich Nietzsche, during long walks through the Alps, noted that only from a distance could he hear his own voice clearly, without the echo of others. From ancient Greek philosophers to today's programmers, the pattern repeats itself. The clearer the vision, the greater the contrast with the environment. Yet this distancing comes at a cost, navigating paths that don't appear on society's collective map, a kind of alienation that even the most insightful can't escape. For Arthur Schopenhauer, the same solitude that makes room for great thoughts can also feel like an invisible chain. Many of the greatest minds in philosophy, science, and art have walked through corridors of depression and anxiety. Not because they were weak, but because they saw the world at depths most people never even imagine exploring. This raises a question we can't ignore. Is isolation a punishment or a privilege? For the German philosopher, the answer was crystal clear. He argued that a thinker should treat their own room as a sanctuary, because only away from social noise, that concert of repeated voices, can the mind produce truly original notes. When conversations outside become empty formalities, silence inside becomes golden. Schopenhauer saw daily interactions not as genuine exchanges, but as performances. People step onto the stage, play predetermined roles, and leave without ever revealing the backstage of their desires. In this theater, the main goal isn't understanding, but impressing others. Sociability for him is like wearing a mask. carefully polished expressions on the outside, hidden banality within. This pessimistic viewpoint ties directly into his key work, The World as Will and Representation. Everything we perceive, he argues, is a projection of our own minds, a private spectacle we mistake for objective reality. To live bound by social conventions, then, is like watching a play that distracts us from the only investigation that really matters, diving deeply into ourselves and the very nature of existence. And you, watching this video, do you feel this double weight? The door between outside noise and inner silence stands ajar. Which side will you choose? Schopenhauer saw most people moving through life as if competing for spots on a narrow stage, chasing flashy titles, feeding gossip, and collecting small social victories. Behind every gesture, he said, was the will, an irrational force that renews desire the moment it seems satisfied. Seeking likes, positions, or fancy invitations, then, is just obeying this engine that never lets us rest. Those who think more deeply see this race from a different angle. To them, society looks like a game where appearance counts more than actual moves, and nobody notices the pieces that fall along the way. The result is a sort of critical boredom. Interactions skim the surface and rarely reach anything meaningful. Schopenhauer wasn't alone in exposing this show. Nietzsche, for instance, also lifted the curtain to reveal the emptiness behind easy applause. From this contrast comes a deep gap. Serious pursuit of knowledge requires silence, time, and questions that don't fit casual conversation. So the deeper someone goes, the more social life feels like wearing clothes that are too tight. Isolation becomes almost inevitable, bringing risks. Prolonged solitude might lead to apathy, disillusionment, or even contempt for what's outside. Schopenhauer acknowledged this side effect and proposed a straightforward solution. Accept solitude as part of the journey and learn to walk with it without trying to rejoin the chorus. Have you ever noticed how isolation sneaks into the daily lives of people who think beyond average? Even when surrounded by others, they wonder why conversations stay superficial and attempts at depth sink quickly. In the next lines, we'll look at the silent clash between genius and convention, and understand why it pushes great minds away from ordinary social interactions. Arthur Schopenhauer was straightforward. He considered most people driven by immediate interests, vanity, and little appetite for deep thought. When someone with greater intellectual capacity faces this reality, a nearly impossible gap opens up. On one side are highly intelligent people. On the other, the crowd distracted by trivialities flashing like bright billboards. There's a cruel detail. Mediocrity recognizes only itself, but the genius sees the whole picture, including mediocrity, and in that reflection discovers their own loneliness. The distance grows because the thinker seeks to understand reality deeply, while most people are busy chasing social rankings, petty gossip, or disposable entertainment. When a genius tries to unravel the mysteries of existence and share their findings, the response almost always comes as indifference or confusion. This mismatch helps explain the disappointment many great thinkers feel when looking at society. Schopenhauer admitted feeling uncomfortable whenever he had to deal with what he called ordinary people. To him, dominant mediocrity suffocated the creative spark of the few genuine geniuses. This idea echoes Voltaire's biting words, but above all, it highlights a mismatch of interests. A brilliant mind spends time hunting universal truths, while most people fill their days chasing quick pleasures and distractions. There's no common ground, hence the constant friction. For Schopenhauer, every superficial conversation was like a prison for someone who thinks on another level. The lives of great innovators confirm this pattern. Nikola Tesla avoided parties and social gatherings, convinced they'd waste the energy he preferred saving for his inventions. Isaac Newton would leave conversations the moment they lost scientific depth, gaining a reputation for impatience. Even Albert Einstein, physics pop icon, admitted he found more value in silence than in groups unable to discuss essential ideas. Yet it's not always the genius who walks away. Often it's the group that pushes them out. Thinking outside common sense usually irritates others, and new ideas, by disturbing comfort zones, tend to provoke resistance. Nietzsche called this reaction the resentment of mediocrity, the urge to belittle anything incomprehensible or superior that reveals others' limitations. This ongoing conflict illustrates the lasting tension between rare creativity and collective comfort. The genius doesn't distance themselves just out of whim. They're pushed away by constant clashes with an environment that doesn't get their worldview. When hostility traps them, feelings of alienation arise, along with a deep fatigue from the empty conversations that fill social gatherings. That leads inevitably to a question. If reality seems hostile to brilliant minds, what path is left for them? Schopenhauer didn't suggest shaping oneself to collective expectations, but instead retreating into a refuge untouched by external noise: solitude. To him, solitude blends fate and choice. It emerges almost inevitably from an intelligence that sees beyond appearances, yet it provides fertile ground to refine ideas and nourish the spirit. Ordinary people avoid being alone because they need the echo of others to confirm their own existence. Exceptional minds seek out quiet rooms because there they find themselves. This distinction brings us to a crucial point. Being alone isn't punishment, it's freedom. Inside this private space, the thinker dives deeply into their own thoughts without distractions, or the obligation to follow daily rituals that numb the mind. It's in this dense silence, far from stages and crowds, that creativity bursts out powerfully, and understanding takes root, opening paths to even bolder insights that extend beyond this moment. Behind many creative breakthroughs, there's a common scene. Someone sitting quietly, away from the noise. And it's there that thoughts come alive. Emily Dickinson spent decades barely leaving her room, pouring each idea into poems that still resonate today. Kant, sticking to a strict schedule, refused invitations to protect his hours of reflection. Beethoven, when deafness forced him inward, discovered notes that the outside world couldn't offer. Solitude does more than just provide time. It creates a clean stage where originality stays intact. Schopenhauer warned that the noise of crowds muddles the vision of those who strive for something deeper. His philosophy echoed the Buddhism he studied so closely. Attachment to external things leads to suffering, while stepping back reveals deeper layers of reality. But there's a tension that's impossible to ignore. We're wired to seek groups, exchange affection, and confirm that we belong. Staying too distant turns the privilege of introspection into heavy anxiety. Dickinson, Kant, Beethoven all felt the pain of living on the fringes, even as they drew rare creative nectar from their solitude. Nietzsche saw solitude as the price of greatness, but he recognized how painful that price could be. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he portrays the philosopher-prophet as a hermit who descends from the mountain to share his message, only to find closed doors and mocking laughter. This scene highlights a familiar dilemma. Distancing yourself from society grants freedom, but also hands you an existential burden few can carry. Schopenhauer faced the same question and suggested an alternative approach. He believed no genius ever fully fits into social molds, yet they can still move among people without absorbing the mediocrity around them. The key lies in developing an inner withdrawal, a philosophical distance that works like a protective shield. This allows coexistence without drowning. So the unavoidable question emerges. How can someone navigate a shallow world without being swallowed by its superficiality? If having a brilliant mind seems to condemn you to loneliness, how do great thinkers survive in a crowd without suffocating? Schopenhauer summed up the answer simply: detachment. Staying whole amidst the noise, turning your own consciousness into a home where you are enough. At this point, happiness stops begging for external applause and finds shelter in self-sufficiency. Schopenhauer discovered early on that the trick wasn't to bend the world to his will or squeeze himself into other people's molds. The key point, according to him, was cultivating an attitude of calm distance, watching life unfold like observing an experiment in a lab. When mediocrity knocks at the door, and it always does, instead of fighting it angrily, the thinker faces it with clinical curiosity, without surrendering to emotions that cloud judgment. This mindset means accepting the shallowness of many social interactions, without letting irritation set in. It also requires recognizing most people's intellectual limits, without slipping into contempt, preserving mental freedom, and needing no external applause. Stoicism had already promoted something similar, controlling your own emotions amid everyday chaos. Marcus Aurelius reinforced this in his Meditations, reminding us that governing oneself is far more valuable than criticizing the foolishness of others. Yet Schopenhauer didn't see absolute isolation as a practical way out. Even brilliant minds need some human contact, whether to exchange ideas or simply avoid drowning in loneliness. The solution lies in choosing relationships with surgical precision. Engage just enough to stay sane, never enough to become dependent. Today, as we swim through endless notifications, misleading headlines, and shallow relationships, the same logic is crucial. Filtering the flood of information and carefully calibrating each connection has become a matter of intellectual survival, exactly as the philosopher predicted. Understanding the world is only half the job. The other half is getting through it without losing your identity. For Schopenhauer, feeling out of sync with the crowd isn't misfortune. It's a sign of mental independence. The lack of applause might feel heavy, but it also opens up a quiet corridor where ideas grow without external judgment. This brings us to the question hovering over each daily choice. Is it better to shape yourself to fit your environment, or accept it as it is and defend your mind's personal space? If you've stuck around this far, you've probably noticed that the link between clarity and withdrawal isn't random. It comes from the exhaustion shallow conversations cause in those who see beyond the surface. Schopenhauer observed that inquisitive minds prefer solitude, not from arrogance, but because superficial talk drains energy needed for creation. The sharper your insight, the greater the peace found in the company of a few good books and your own thoughts. But does that mean the solitary path is mandatory? Not at all. It simply offers a less crowded route. The core question becomes how to turn isolation into a productive retreat. Being alone doesn't mean abandonment. It means opportunity. Polishing your ideas far from voices pushing you toward convenient shortcuts. It's during this pause that you test your certainties, adjust directions, and decide, like a patient sailor, when to return to the social currents. Maybe this is the true measure of intelligence, deciding moment by moment when to tune into the world's broadcast and when to listen solely to the quiet hum of your own mind. If you've stuck around this far, chances are you've experienced that curious blend of autonomy and detachment that Schopenhauer described with surgical precision. A sharp mind can feel like a shelter, but sometimes it becomes a cage. And you know what? There's unexpected calm in realizing not every silence needs filling. Not every conversation warrants anxiety. You're not really alone, even if the sound of your footsteps echoes in isolation. Arthur himself warned, "The problem isn't being alone, it's being in bad company." And that's where the story takes a different turn. I remember one late afternoon after hours lost in a dense novel, standing still and staring blankly at the smooth texture of the wall, processing a fresh idea. Suddenly someone popped up asking if I'd seen the latest reality show episode or heard the latest viral gossip. In that moment it hit me. Craving deeper conversations isn't arrogance. It's a fundamental need of the soul. If you've ever felt something similar, You know the pain of speaking a different dialect, sailing in open seas while everyone else settles for a warm puddle. But there's a reward hidden in this apparent discomfort. You don't have to drown in the noise. The privilege of choosing your solitude and the voices that enter it is entirely yours. So let's get straight to the point. If this video sparked something inside you, hit that like button. Share in the comments how it resonated and subscribe so you don't miss the next dive. Or, if you prefer, ignore all this and return to that lively conversation about the weather or the latest TikTok dance. Still, if you've made it this far, I suspect you're looking for stronger sparks. And if these words have already shaken your convictions, get ready for what's coming next. 2 videos are lined up on the horizon, ready to stir your thinking even further in the best possible way. Fair warning, after watching them, certain things might never seem the same again. Click at your own risk, but don't say I didn't warn you.